You live more in your head than in real life, and the research has measured exactly how much of your life you are missing because of it. A Harvard study tracked thousands of people across their daily lives and found that human minds are wandering away from the present moment 47% of waking time. Nearly half of your life is being spent somewhere that is not here. And the finding that came alongside that number was the one that should genuinely stop you. A wandering mind is on average an unhappy mind, regardless of what the mind is wandering to. But here is what the research has not yet told you. And what this video will, the problem is not that you think too much. The problem is a specific feature of how your brain generates experience. And the people who have learned to work with it rather than against it are not thinking less. They are living more. And the mechanism that explains the difference starts with something almost no one has ever explained clearly. By the end of this video, you're going to understand the precise neuroscience of why humans spend so much of their lives in mental time travel rather than in the actual moment they are inhabiting. You will understand what this costs. In happiness, in health, in the quality of your relationships and your work. You will understand the specific profile of the people who are most present and what they are actually doing differently. And you will have 5 documented, research-grounded practices that move the balance, not toward some impossible thought-free state, but toward more of your actual life being genuinely lived rather than mentally rehearsed or rerun. Let's start with the study because the numbers are the foundation of everything that follows. In 2010, Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard University published a paper in the journal Science that was, by the standards of academic psychology, unusually direct in its implications. The paper was titled, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," and it reported the findings of a study that was, methodologically, unlike most research that had come before it. Killingsworth and Gilbert did not ask people to remember how happy they had been, or to estimate how present they were. They tracked people in real time, using a smartphone application that contacted participants at random intervals throughout the day and asked 3 questions. What are you doing right now? Are you thinking about something other than what you are currently doing? And how happy are you feeling right now? The sample was large, more than 2,000 adults, and the data points were extensive, producing over 250 observations. And what the data showed was this. 47% of the time, people's minds were somewhere other than the activity they were actually engaged in. Not 47% of idle time or 47% of boring time. 47% of all waking time across every activity category studied. People's minds wandered while they were working, while they were exercising, while they were having conversations, while they were eating. In every activity except one, and I will get to that exception shortly, mind wandering was the norm more often than full presence, and the happiness finding was equally striking. People were measurably less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were fully engaged in whatever they were doing. And this was true even when the activity they were engaged in was not particularly enjoyable, and even when the content of the mind wandering was pleasant rather than negative. The simple fact of being mentally elsewhere was associated with lower reported happiness, independent of what the mind was doing while it wandered. Killingsworth and Gilbert went further with the causal analysis. They established that the mind wandering was preceding the unhappiness, not following it. The wandering was not the symptom of a person who was already unhappy. The wandering was producing the reduction in happiness. People were making themselves, on average, less happy by being somewhere other than where they actually were. The exception, and the one activity in which mind wandering rates dropped significantly, was intimacy. Close, engaged, physically present connection with another person was the context in which the wandering mind returned most reliably to the present. The research says something significant about that, and we will come back to it. But first, the more fundamental question, why is the human mind designed to spend so much of its time somewhere it is not? The answer to the wandering mind question is neurological before it is psychological. And understanding the neuroscience changes how you relate to the problem. In the late 1990s, neuroscientists studying brain function with functional magnetic resonance imaging made an observation that initially looked like a methodological inconvenience. When research participants were asked to rest, to simply relax and let their minds do whatever they wanted, a specific network of brain regions reliably activated, not deactivated, activated. The resting brain was not quieter than the task-engaged brain. In many ways, it was more active. Marcus Rachel at Washington University in St. Louis named this the default mode network, the constellation of brain regions that constitute the brain's default task-free operating state. The default mode network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, and the angular gyrus, regions that together are involved in self-referential processing, social cognition, autobiographical memory, and what researchers now call mental time travel. The projection of the mind into the past or the future. The default mode network is not a bug. It is one of the most evolutionarily significant features of the human brain, the neural substrate of what distinguishes human cognition most fundamentally from that of other animals. Mental time travel, the capacity to simulate future scenarios, to learn from past experiences by rerunning them in imagination, to project possibilities and plan for contingencies that have not yet occurred, is the cognitive foundation of human planning, creativity, narrative understanding, and what psychologist Thomas Suddendorf at the University of Queensland calls prospection, the ability to pre-experience the future. The default mode network is the engine of human imagination, human planning, and human storymaking. It is doing, when it runs, genuinely important work. The problem is not that it runs. The problem is that it runs constantly, and that the content it generates when left without active direction tends to drift toward the specific categories of mental experience that are most associated with unhappiness. Research by Killingsworth and colleagues found that mind wandering is most commonly to unpleasant, neutral, and past topics, and that the specific pull toward negative self-referential content when the default mode is active is one of the most reliable findings in the neuroscience of ruminative thought. The brain that is not doing anything in particular does not generate pleasant neutral imagery. It tends to generate the mental equivalent of the open tabs, the unresolved concerns, the replayed difficult interactions, the anticipated future difficulties, the self-evaluative commentary that runs quietly whenever there is nothing demanding enough foreground attention to suppress it. The default mode network is the generator of the voice in your head that is narrating, judging, planning, worrying, and replaying continuously. And the research on what that voice costs you, in mood, in attention quality, in the actual experience of your own life, is specific enough to be genuinely worth understanding. Killingsworth and Gilbert's finding is the entry point, but the research on what sustained living in your head costs has gone considerably deeper in the years since, and the picture it has assembled is specific enough to be difficult to dismiss. Research by Susan Nolan-Hoeksema at Yale University on rumination, the repetitive, self-focused processing of negative experience that is the default mode network's most problematic output established that people who spend significant portions of their mental time in ruminative self-focused thought are 3 times more likely to develop clinical depression than people who do not. The ruminative thought style is not simply a correlate of depression. It is a causal contributor, a cognitive pattern that generates and sustains negative affect in ways that are measurable and predictable. Research by Sarah Lazar at Massachusetts General Hospital using neuroimaging found that people who practice sustained present moment attention, specifically through regular meditation, show measurable differences in brain structure compared to non-practitioners, including increased cortical thickness in regions associated with attention and interoception. The brain, in other words, is physically shaped by the degree to which its owner practices being present rather than absent. Research on social cognition and relationship quality found that mind wandering during conversations, the specific form of absence in which you are physically present with another person but mentally elsewhere, is detected by conversation partners with surprising accuracy and is associated with reduced ratings of connection, trust, and understanding. The person whose mind wanders during your conversation with them is registered by your nervous system as less present, less engaged, and less genuinely interested, and this registration happens below the level of conscious awareness, through the subtle reading of attention and responsiveness cues that the social nervous system performs automatically. Research on work performance by Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine, found that mental distraction, the specific form of absence in which attention is nominally on a task while the mind is elsewhere, significantly reduces the quality and efficiency of cognitive work. Mark found that after a significant distraction, it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to return to the original task with full cognitive engagement. The wandering mind is not simply less present, it is measurably less capable, even of the cognitive work it nominally returns to. And research on physical health, a domain that most people do not immediately connect to the quality of mental presence, has found that sustained psychological stress, much of which is generated by the ruminative processing of the wandering mind rather than by actual present tense events, is associated with increased inflammatory markers, impaired immune function, elevated cortisol, and the specific physiological consequences that chronic stress produces across every organ system studied. The mind that lives primarily in its own internal narrative is not simply less happy, though it is that. It is less effective, less connected, and measurably less healthy than the mind that is present. These are not small effects. They are the accumulated differences between 2 different ways of inhabiting a life, measured across years and decades. But here's what is important to understand, and what most conversations about presence and mindfulness miss. The solution is not to stop thinking. The default mode network cannot be turned off, and it should not be. The mental time travel it generates is one of the most valuable cognitive capacities human beings have. The solution is something more specific and more interesting than simply be present. Let me show you what the research has actually found. Before we talk about how to shift the balance, we need to be honest about something that the mindfulness industry often glosses over. Living in your head is not always a problem. Sometimes it is exactly what the situation requires. And confusing presence is always good, with the more nuanced truth produces a different kind of error. Research by Roy Baumeister and colleagues at Florida State University on mental time travel and human advantage documented the specific cognitive benefits of the default mode network's temporal projection capacity. Humans, more than any other known species, plan for futures that may be years away, learn from past that occurred decades ago, simulate social scenarios that have not yet happened, and create imaginative worlds that exist nowhere in physical reality, but that motivate real behavior in the present. These are not incidental features of human cognition. They are the foundations of human civilization. The architect who is designing a building that does not yet exist is living in their head productively. The person who is grieving a loss and finding its place in their life story is living in their head necessarily. The person who is preparing for a difficult conversation by mentally rehearsing what they want to say is living in their head adaptively. The person who is generating creative solutions to a problem by allowing the mind to free associate is living in their head usefully. None of these forms of mental absence from the immediate present are problems to be corrected. Research by Malia Mason at Columbia University found that mind wandering during tasks that are sufficiently automatic, tasks that do not require active conscious engagement, is actually associated with more creative problem solving, because the default mode network's associative, nonlinear processing is precisely the kind of thinking that generates novel connections. The wandering mind during an automatic task is not wasted. It is doing the kind of loose, wide-ranging processing that the focused, task-engaged mode cannot. The problem is not mental time travel per se. The problem is three specific forms of mental time travel that the research has identified as reliably costly and minimally useful. The first is unproductive rumination, the repetitive replay of past events without the meaning-making and resolution that would make the replay useful. Not reflection, which moves through past experience toward understanding, but the circular passive replaying that generates affect without insight. The second is anticipatory anxiety, the simulation of future negative events in enough detail to produce present tense physiological stress responses without the productive planning that would make the simulation useful. Not preparation, which imagines difficulty in order to develop responses to it, but the open-ended imagining of worst cases that produces fear without action. The third is self-evaluative commentary, the running internal narrative that judges, criticizes, compares, and evaluates the self against real or imagined standards without the honest self-assessment that would make such commentary useful. Not genuine self-reflection which seeks understanding, but the automatic, often harsh internal monologue that runs below the level of directed thought. These three forms, unproductive rumination, anticipatory anxiety, and self-evaluative commentary, are what the default mode network generates when it is running without direction and when its content has drifted into the self-critical threat monitoring mode that the negativity bias tends to pull it toward. And they account for the majority of the unhappy mind wandering that Killingsworth and Gilbert's research documented. The ungoverned default mode is not a free mind. It is a mind that has been handed to the most anxious, most critical, most threat-focused version of your mental life. And understanding the difference between that and the productive, genuinely useful forms of mental time travel is the foundation of the practices that actually shift the balance. But before we get to those practices, there is one more dimension of the living in your head problem that most people have never had explained clearly. One that involves not just your relationship with your own thoughts, but with your own sense of self. There is a distinction in the psychological literature that is both precise and, when genuinely understood, quite liberating. It is the distinction between what psychologists and meditation researchers call the narrative self and the observing self. And understanding it changes how you think about the relationship between you and the voice in your head. The narrative self is the story-making dimension of your psychology. It is the dimension that generates the continuous running commentary on experience, that narrates events, assigns meaning, interprets the behavior of others, evaluates your own performance, and constructs the coherent autobiographical story that constitutes your sense of who you are over time. The narrative self is largely a product of the default mode network. It is the self that is always, in some sense, living in its own story. Research by Dan McAdams at Northwestern University on narrative identity established that the narrative self is not peripheral to human psychology. It is central to it. The stories people tell about their lives, about who they are, where they came from, what has happened to them, and what it means, are not simply descriptions of a pre-existing self. They are constitutive of the self. The narrative is not about the person. The narrative is, in a meaningful sense, the person. The observing self is different. It is the dimension of awareness that notices the narrative without being fully identified with it. The part of your experience that can register, I am having the thought that I am a failure, rather than simply experiencing the thought as a direct statement of fact about reality. The part that can watch the anxious replay without being entirely inside it. The part that is aware of the voice in the head rather than simply being the voice. This distinction between the narrative self that generates thoughts and the observing self that can witness them is one of the foundational insights in both contemplative traditions and contemporary clinical psychology. Research by Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada on acceptance and commitment therapy identified what he calls self as context, the stable observational perspective from which all experience, including thought and emotion, can be witnessed without full identification, as a core component of psychological flexibility and resilience. The research on the difference between these two modes of self-relation is specific. People who have developed stronger access to the observing self, through meditation practice, through act-based interventions, or through other forms of deliberate self-observation, show lower levels of ruminative processing, greater emotional regulation, greater capacity for present moment engagement, and better psychological outcomes across multiple domains, not because they have less of the narrative self. The narrative self does not disappear through psychological development, but because they have developed a second vantage point from which the narrative can be seen as narrative, as the brain's story-making activity, rather than as the direct experience of reality. The person who can watch the voice in their head rather than being entirely inside it has a fundamentally different relationship with the experience of living in their head. And that relationship is the foundation of everything that actually helps. Let's talk about what the opposite of living in your head feels like. The state that the research has found is associated with the highest levels of both performance and subjective well-being, and that turns out to be deeply relevant to everything we are discussing. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi at Claremont Graduate University spent decades studying what he called flow, the state of complete absorption in an activity in which the sense of self temporarily dissolves, time distorts, and performance reaches its natural peak. Csikszentmihalyi described flow as the experience of being fully alive, a state qualitatively different from ordinary experience in its character of complete present tense engagement. The neurological signature of flow, studied by researchers including Arne Dietrich at the American University of Beirut and Ulrich Ott at the University of Gießen, involves a specific pattern of neural activity that is almost the mirror image of rumination. Where ruminative default mode processing involves heightened self-referential activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, flow is associated with transient hypofrontality, a temporary reduction in activity in precisely the regions associated with self-monitoring and narrative self-construction. In flow, the default mode network goes quiet, not through suppression, but through the specific condition in which incoming task demands are exactly matched to the person's skill level, challenging enough to require full engagement, manageable enough to make successful engagement possible. In this condition, attention becomes fully absorbed in the present tense demands of the activity. The narrative self temporarily pauses, and what remains is the observing engagement with what is actually happening in real time. Csikszentmihalyi's research found that flow states are among the highest rated experiential states in terms of subjective quality, rated above even leisure and relaxation in most samples. People describe flow as the experience of life at its most vivid, most real, most fully inhabited. And the defining feature of flow, across every activity domain in which it has been studied, is complete present tense absorption, the temporary cessation of the narrative self's commentary. This is the neuroscience of what full presence actually feels like. Not a blank, thought-free state, not a simple absence of the thinking mind, but the specific condition in which engagement with what is actually here is so complete that the parallel processing of the narrative self's commentary has nothing to attach to. And the research on what produces this condition and how its production can be extended beyond the narrow circumstances that spontaneously generate it is directly applicable to the challenge of living less in your head and more in your actual life. The conditions for flow, Csikszentmihalyi found, are a clear goal, immediate feedback on progress, and a balance between challenge and skill. These conditions produce the specific attentional engagement that quiets the default mode, and any activity in any domain can be approached with these conditions if the person deliberately structures it that way. But flow is not the only form of genuine presence. And the research has found something even more important and more universally accessible, something that goes to the heart of why the Killingsworth and Gilbert study found the exception it found. Return for a moment to the Killingsworth and Gilbert finding that intimate connection was the activity associated with the lowest mind-wandering rates. Of all the activities studied, work, exercise, rest, commuting, eating alone, intimate connection with another person was the one in which the wandering mind most reliably returned to the present. This finding has a specific neuroscientific explanation, and that explanation connects directly to one of the most important findings in all of social neuroscience. Research by James Cohn at the University of Virginia on social baseline theory established that the human nervous system's default state is not, as it might appear, a solitary one. The human nervous system evolved to function within close social proximity, to experience the presence of trusted others as a fundamental regulatory resource that reduces the energetic and threat processing demands of navigating the environment. In Cohen's framework, social connection is not a supplement to baseline human experience. It is the baseline. What this means for the mind-wandering question is specific. When you are genuinely present with another person, when genuine social connection is occurring, with the mutual attentiveness, responsiveness, and care that genuine connection involves, the nervous system registers this as a form of safety and resource that reduces the ambient threat monitoring that drives much of the default mode's anxious self-referential processing. The mind that is genuinely with another person has less need for the vigilant internal monitoring that the isolated mind performs. The threat systems are quieted by the social safety signal, and with the threat systems quieted, the default mode's tendency toward anxious self-referential processing is reduced. The present tense social interaction occupies the attentional foreground in a way that the default mode's commentary finds difficult to compete with. This is why genuine conversation, not the kind where you are waiting for your turn to speak while mentally composing your response, but the kind where you are actually receiving what the other person is saying and genuinely responding to it, is one of the most reliable routes to present tense experience available to human beings. And it is why the quality of your close relationships is not separate from the question of how much of your life you are actually living. The person who has genuine present tense, mutually attentive relationships is a person whose nervous system is regularly returned to the present. And the person who lacks such relationships, who is predominantly in their own internal narrative, relating to remembered and imagined others rather than actual present tense ones, has lost one of the primary external anchors that the nervous system uses to return to real-time experience. Research by Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz, summarizing the Harvard study of adult development, found that the quality of close relationships is the single strongest predictor of well-being in later life. Not wealth, not professional achievement, not health behaviors. The quality of close relationships. And what the living in your head research adds to that finding is the mechanism. Genuine close relationship is one of the most reliable conditions for the mind's return to the actual experience of being alive, rather than the mental simulation of it. We are now at the halfway point of what I want to tell you, and what comes next is the part that actually changes things. Here's the finding that should change how you think about this entire topic. The research on mindfulness, presence, and the reduction of unhelpful mind wandering has converged on something that the popular presentation of these topics consistently misrepresents. The goal is not the elimination of the thinking mind. It is not the achievement of a permanently quiet, thought-free state of consciousness. That state is neither possible nor desirable. The default mode network is doing genuinely important work, and attempting to permanently silence it is both futile and counterproductive. The goal is something more specific, the development of a flexible relationship with your own mental activity, the capacity to be in the narrative when the narrative is useful, and to step out of it when presence is more valuable. To use the mind's time travel capacity productively rather than being used by it. To notice, with some regularity and some ease, when the wandering mind has taken you somewhere that is neither useful nor pleasurable, and to be able to return, not with effort or self-criticism, but with the simple skill of noticing and returning. Research by Judson Brewer at Brown University's Mindfulness Center identified the specific neural mechanism through which this flexibility is developed. Brewer's research used neuroimaging to study experienced meditators and found that with practice, meditators showed reduced activity in the posterior cingulate cortex, a key hub of the default mode network, not during meditation only, but during ordinary daily activity. The practice of deliberate, regular return to the present was producing a change in the brain's default operating mode. Brewer also identified the specific mechanism, the relationship between the meditating brain and its own mental content. Novice meditators and non-meditators tend to become fused with the content of their thinking, to experience their thoughts as direct statements of reality rather than as the brain's activity. Experienced practitioners develop what he called metacognitive awareness, the capacity to notice thoughts as thoughts, to observe the mind's activity from the observing self position without full identification with the content. This metacognitive awareness is not a mystical state, it is a trainable cognitive skill, and the research on how to train it is specific enough to produce usable practice. But before the specific practices, there is a cognitive shift that the research has identified as the most fundamental, the one that underlies every effective technique for developing a more present relationship with your own life. The fundamental shift is this: from treating your thoughts as experience to treating your thoughts as objects of experience. From being inside the narrative to being the awareness that notices the narrative. From the thought, I am a failure, to the noticed experience, the mind is generating a failure narrative. The shift is subtle. Its effects are not. Research by Kirk Warren Brown at Virginia Commonwealth University on mindful awareness found that people who scored higher on a measure of present moment non-judgmental awareness showed significantly lower levels of negative affect, anxiety, and ruminative processing, and these effects held even after controlling for personality variables, neuroticism, and prior mental health history. The awareness itself, independent of any formal practice, was associated with better outcomes, because the awareness is the mechanism. The moment you can observe the mind's activity as the mind's activity rather than as direct reality is the moment you have stepped outside the narrative self and into the observing self. And from the observing self, the content of the narrative has less power, not because it disappears, but because you are no longer fully inside it. This is the core of the entire living in your head challenge, not the content of what the mind generates, your relationship to that content. And developing a different relationship is, the research shows, genuinely possible and produces measurable changes in the quality of daily experience that accumulate across a life. Let's be concrete. Because insight without practice is just more thinking. The research has produced 5 specific documented approaches that develop the capacity for more present tense experience, more of your actual life being genuinely inhabited rather than mentally processed in parallel. These are not prescriptions, they are tools. And the tool that fits your particular version of the living in your head problem is the one worth investing in. The first practice is formal mindfulness meditation, specifically open monitoring practice. There are 2 primary forms of mindfulness meditation that the research has studied extensively. Focused attention practice, which trains the capacity to sustain attention on a single object, typically the breath, and to notice and return when the mind wanders. And open monitoring practice, which trains the capacity to observe the full field of mental experience without preference or judgment, noticing thoughts, sensations, and feelings as they arise and pass. Research by Antoine Lutz at the University of Wisconsin-Madison found that focused attention practice and open monitoring practice produce different patterns of neural change. Focused attention practice strengthens the capacity for sustained voluntary attention, the ability to direct and hold attention where you choose. Open monitoring practice strengthens metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe the mind's activity from the broader observational field. For the living in your head challenge, open monitoring practice is particularly relevant. The capacity to sit in awareness of mental activity without being pulled into identification with it, to watch the default mode's output with something like the equanimity of a naturalist observing an interesting phenomenon, is the specific skill that reduces the unhappy mind wandering that the research has documented. The practical entry point: 10 minutes per day, sitting quietly, allowing the mind to do what it does, but deliberately shifting the perspective from being inside the thoughts to observing them. When you notice that you have been inside a thought, fully engaged with its narrative, simply note that and return to the broader observational position. Not with criticism, not with effort to suppress the thought, with the same patient, curious observation you might bring to watching clouds. Research by Sarah Lazar found measurable changes in cortical thickness in the insular and sensory cortices of experienced practitioners after an average of 7-5 years of regular practice. But more relevant for practical purposes, research on the effects of even brief mindfulness training found measurable improvements in attentional control and reductions in mind wandering after interventions as short as 2 weeks of daily 10-minute practice. The second practice is what researchers call noting, the deliberate labeling of mental events as they occur. Research by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA on affect labeling, the act of putting words to emotional experience, found that the simple act of naming an emotional state produces measurable reductions in amygdala reactivity and increased prefrontal engagement. The naming activates the regulatory neural systems and reduces the automatic reactivity of the emotional systems. Applied to the living in your head challenge, when you notice the mind has wandered and you can identify where it has gone, name it. Not elaborately, simply planning, worrying, replaying, judging. The noting does something neurologically significant. It activates the observing self and creates the tiny but consequential distance between you and the mental activity. The thought you have named is already slightly less overwhelming than the thought you were entirely inside. And the practice of noting maintained consistently strengthens the metacognitive awareness that is the foundation of genuine flexibility with your own mental life. The third practice is deliberate engagement quality, bringing active attention to activities that would otherwise be automatic. Research on habit and automaticity by Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California found that approximately 43% of everyday behavior is performed in habitual, automatic mode without conscious engagement. Much of what you do each day, you're not present for You're performing automatic sequences while the mind is elsewhere because the behavior does not require conscious direction. The practice of deliberate engagement quality reverses this. When eating, eat. Not eating while checking your phone or eating while reviewing the day's events in your mind. When walking, walk. Noticing the sensations of movement, the quality of the air, the specific visual field of the present environment. When in conversation, be in the conversation, attending fully to what the other person is saying, receiving it genuinely before formulating your response. This is not about performing mindfulness as a performance. It is about the specific choice to bring genuine attention to the experience you are actually having, rather than processing it in parallel while your mind is elsewhere. Each instance of this choice is small. Their accumulation is what shifts the ratio of your life that is genuinely lived, rather than mentally processed from the outside. The fourth practice is physical presence, using the body as an anchor to the present moment. The body is always in the present tense. It is the only part of you that cannot be in the past or the future. Whatever the mind is doing, the body is here, breathing, sensing, feeling the temperature of the air, the weight of gravity, the texture of whatever is in contact with the skin. Research by Bessel van der Kolk at Boston University on body-based approaches to trauma and psychological well-being established that bringing deliberate attention to physical sensation is one of the most reliable routes to present tense experience available, precisely because physical sensation is inherently present tense, and because attending to it requires the kind of engaged perception that the default mode's abstract processing cannot easily occupy simultaneously. The practice. When you notice the mind has traveled, use a sensory anchor to return. The sensation of the breath, the feeling of the feet on the floor, the specific quality of light in the space you are in, the temperature of a cup in your hands, not a suppression of the mental activity. The thoughts can continue, but as the deliberate direction of a portion of attention to something that is genuinely, unambiguously here. In the here, the wandering mind finds something real to engage with. The fifth practice is what researchers call scheduling the worry, deliberately allocating time for the ruminative processing that the default mode generates, rather than allowing it to run throughout the day. Research by Borkovich, Wilkinson, Folensby, and Lerman at Penn State on scheduled worry time found that assigning a specific, bounded time period each day for the deliberate engagement with concerns, plans, and difficult topics, and actively postponing these thoughts when they arise outside that period, produced significant reductions in the frequency and intensity of intrusive ruminative thought throughout the day. The mechanism, the Zeigarnik effect, as we discussed in an earlier video on this channel, produces cognitive persistence of open loops. The mind returns repeatedly to unresolved concerns because the cognitive system has not received the signal that the concern has been attended to. Scheduled worry time provides a designated context in which the concern will be genuinely addressed, delivering enough of a closure signal to allow the mind to release it, temporarily, during the rest of the day. The practical version. Set aside 15 to 20 minutes at a consistent time each day for deliberate engagement with your concerns, your planning, your difficult topics. When ruminative thoughts arise outside that window, practice the noting technique. Planning or worrying, and return to the present knowing that the concern has a designated time and does not need to be solved right now. The mind, with some consistency of practice, learns to defer to the scheduled time rather than insisting on immediate processing. There is a dimension of the living in your head challenge that purely attentional and neurological frameworks can miss. And it is worth addressing directly, because it is the dimension that most immediately speaks to the quality of a life. Research by Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor whose logotherapy framework has influenced clinical psychology for decades, and by more recent researchers on meaning and well-being established that the experience of meaning and the experience of presence are deeply connected. Not identical, but mutually reinforcing in ways that have been documented with increasing precision. Research by Michael Steger at Colorado State University on meaning in life found that the experience of life as meaningful as mattering, as pointing towards something significant, as sugisu sam, is one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being, resilience, and what Steger calls subjective vitality. And the experience of meaning is most available, Steger's research found, in states of genuine engagement, states in which the person is genuinely present to what they are doing, rather than experiencing it from the remove of the internal narrative. The person who eats a meal while mentally elsewhere has not fully eaten the meal. The person who has a conversation while half composing their response has not fully been in the conversation. The person who goes through a day's activities while the default mode processes in parallel has not fully lived that day. And the cumulative effect of this partial presence, of a life that is technically being lived while the person is largely somewhere else, is a specific form of meaninglessness that is not about the content of the activities, but about the quality of engagement with them. Research by Ryan and Dacey on vitality, the subjective sense of being alive, energetic, and genuinely engaged, found that vitality is most available in conditions of autonomous, present-tense engagement with valued activities. The person who is genuinely here, doing something that genuinely matters to them, with full attention available for the doing, that person has the highest access to the subjective experience of being alive that the research has measured. The living in your head problem is not ultimately an attentional problem, though it is partly that. It is ultimately a presence to your own life problem. The question it poses is not, how do I quiet my mind, but how do I be more genuinely here? And the answer is not separate from the questions of what you value, what you are doing with your time, and whether the activities of your life are ones that you genuinely want to be present for. Research by Tim Kasser at Knox College on time affluence, the experience of having enough time, or choosing to spend time in ways that feel genuinely chosen rather than obligated, found that the subjective sense of time affluence is associated with higher well-being, more present-tense engagement, and lower rates of the anxious future orientation that is one of the default mode's most costly outputs. The person who is chronically time-pressured, chronically behind, chronically managing the gap between what needs to be done and what is available, that person's default mode is consistently being pulled toward future planning and anticipatory anxiety, making present-tense engagement progressively less available. The implication: the practice of presence is not only about attentional technique, it is also about the structural conditions of daily life that either support or undermine genuine engagement. And sometimes the most powerful practice of presence is the structural change, the decision to do fewer things with more genuine attention rather than more things with divided attention, that creates the conditions in which genuine presence becomes naturally more available. There is a paradox embedded in this entire conversation that honesty requires addressing, and it is one that the mindfulness industry has done a poor job of naming. The deliberate pursuit of presence, the project of monitoring yourself for mind wandering, evaluating your level of presence, trying to be more mindful, can itself become a form of living in your head. The self-monitoring mind that is checking whether it is sufficiently present is, by definition, engaged in self-referential processing. It is inside the narrative self's commentary, even if the commentary is now about the quality of its own engagement with the present moment. Research by Jonathan Schooler at the University of California, Santa Barbara on meta-awareness and mind-wandering found that there is a specific variety of mind-wandering that he calls unaware, in which the person is mentally absent without any awareness that they have drifted. And there is another variety in which the person is mentally present but in a self-monitoring, effortful way that is itself a form of divided attention. The goal, Schooler's research suggests, is not the effortful maintenance of presence through continuous self-monitoring. It is the development of what he calls re-engagement without awareness, the increasing tendency for the mind to return to the present without a deliberate act of self-correction, as if presence has become the default rather than the effortful project. This is what experienced meditators describe, and what the neuroscience of long-term practice suggests. Not a state of effortful present moment monitoring, but a gradually increased natural affinity for present tense engagement. Not the constant project of not being in your head, but the gradually developed capacity for being genuinely here as a natural resting state rather than a deliberate achievement. The practices we have discussed, the open monitoring meditation, the noting, the deliberate engagement quality, the physical anchor, the scheduled worry, are not ends in themselves. They are training. The repetition of specific cognitive movements, noticing, returning, observing, releasing, that practice consistently over time, gradually changes the default setting of the mind, not eliminating the default mode network's activity, changing the nature and direction of that activity, and developing a more flexible relationship with it, so that the wandering is less reflexive and the return is more natural. And the outcome of that development, the gradually increasing naturalness of genuine present tense engagement, is something qualitatively different from the effortful mindfulness of the beginner. It is the specific quality of aliveness that Csikszentmihalyi's flow research was pointing at. Not a permanent state, but a significantly more frequent one. Not the absence of the narrative self, but its appearance in the role of a tool that you use rather than a weather system that you are inside. Let's take the widest view, because we have been examining mechanisms and practices, and it is worth understanding what the research says happens across a life when the balance shifts. The Killingsworth and Gilbert study found that 47% of waking life is spent in mind-wandering that, on average, reduces happiness. Even shifting that percentage meaningfully, from 47 to 37, or from 37 to 27, across a human life represents an enormous amount of recovered experience. Days, weeks, months of genuine inhabitation of a life that was previously being processed from a remove. Research by Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz on the Harvard study of adult development found that the quality of people's relationships is the single strongest predictor of well-being across the lifespan. And the quality of relationships is directly related to the quality of presence within them, because genuine relationship is made of genuine encounter, and genuine encounter requires the person who shows up to actually be there. The accumulated presence within close relationships over years and decades is the architecture of the relational depth that the Harvard study identified as what makes a life go well. Research by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania on flourishing, the state of thriving rather than merely managing, identified engagement as one of the 5 core elements of flourishing. Not pleasure, not achievement, not the absence of difficulty. Engagement, the specific quality of absorbed, present tense involvement in activities that the person finds meaningful. More present tense engagement across more domains of daily life is not a peripheral quality of life improvement. It is, on the available evidence, one of the central mechanisms through which lives become genuinely worth living. And there is a finding from the subjective side of the research that is worth naming directly. People who are asked late in life about regret, about the experiences and choices they wish they had inhabited more fully, do not typically report regret about the experiences they had. They report regret about the experiences they were physically present for, but mentally absent from. The conversation they were in while thinking about something else. The event they attended while worried about something else. The years they spent managing the mental simulation of their life while their actual life was happening in parallel and largely unattended. This is the specific form of loss that the living in your head problem produces. Not the loss of experience. The loss of inhabitation of experience. The life that was technically lived, but not fully received. And the research suggests, with encouraging consistency, that the shift from predominantly absent to more genuinely present, imperfect, gradual, never complete, is one of the most consequential changes a person can make in how they relate to their own existence. You are already here. The question the research is asking you is whether you are actually experiencing it. Here is what I want to leave you with. Today, not as a project, not as a new identity to perform, try one thing. At some point in the next few hours, when you notice that your mind has traveled somewhere that is neither pleasant nor useful, when you catch the ruminative replay or the anxious future simulation or the self-evaluative commentary running in the background, try the simplest version of the noting practice. Name it. Planning. Worrying. Replaying. Just the name. And then, without criticism, without effort, without the project of being more mindful, return your attention to whatever is actually here. The physical sensation, the specific quality of the present moment, whatever is genuinely in front of you, that is it. One noticing. One return. Not a practice you need to sustain for 10 minutes. Not a meditation session you need to schedule. One moment of stepping out of the narrative and into the present. The research says that moment, practiced repeatedly over time, changes things, not dramatically or all at once, but cumulatively, measurably in the direction of more of your actual life being genuinely yours. If this kind of conversation, specific, grounded in real research, and honest about what actually matters and how human beings experience being alive, is what you are looking for, this channel is built exactly for that. Every video is the same commitment. The science of how the mind works and what it means for the life you're actually living. See you in the next one.